This is part 2 in a series of videos. The first one is what is the gut-brain axis and why is it important to you? If you haven't seen that already, I suggest you go watch it first before watching this one. So the first video explains the connection between the mind and the gut. And in that video I mentioned that what starts it all off is decreased activity in the brain. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So decreased activity in the brain can come from many reasons. One of the biggest known ones is drug use. Most drugs will decrease activity in the brain, including the more commonly used ones such as alcohol. In fact, I was just reading today online a discussion about somebody who had attempted to take their own life with an overdose of drug and was experiencing some pretty severe effects of decreased brain activity. The interesting thing about that for me is the knock-on effects that will have in the rest of the body, and then what we can do, what steps we can take to address that. So an event like that, like an overdose of a drug, would actually be called what they call an acute stress. There's two types of stress, acute and chronic. I believe most of us in this society have actually become desensitized to stress. A lot of us kind of just carry on our day-to-day lives, struggling through with a lot of the symptoms of some pretty severe chronic stress, but wouldn't necessarily call ourselves stressed just because we're so accustomed to it. So first of all, I would actually argue that most of us are undergoing chronic stress in today's world. Getting the kids to school, going to work, meeting deadlines, and just generally not having the appropriate kind of response from the people around us to support us in an emotionally healthy way. Kaethe Weingarten, I believe is how you pronounce her name, author of Common Shock, talks about this quite a lot in her book. If you're interested in reading up on how other people's emotional responses can help or hinder your healthy emotional state for you, then I definitely recommend reading it, and I'll put a link to it in the description below. The other interesting thing for me is that actually 70% of adults in the US have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their lives. That is 223.4 million people in the US alone. So that's a pretty significant number of people on the planet. I would actually argue that that number is probably higher, but again, most of us have been socially conditioned to kind of just carry on, buckle through, not talk about it, sweep it under the rug, and just try and carry on with our lives as if nothing happened. Now this can be extremely damaging, both to ourselves and to society as a whole, because we then start living out of that place that's been traumatized and we don't ever deal with it, and so we can actually pass on that trauma to other people, especially our kids. For example, 4 out of every 10 children in America say they have experienced a physical assault during the past year, with 1 in 10 receiving an assault-related injury. Now that number is huge, that's just unacceptable. At the same time, we also see that the digestive issues are absolutely rife in America right now. IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, or IBD, irritable bowel disorder, is the second most common reason for missing work behind the common cold now. Now that's just crazy to me. That's people running to the bathroom, people being constipated, inflammation in their gut, and you can tell if you've watched my first video what kind of a state our minds are going to be in if that many people are sick with digestive issues that severe. And then compounding this issue of the doctors where patients come in with IBS and are told, oh, there's nothing wrong with you, or you have a bug, it's a virus, take this antibiotic, it's all in your head. Sorry guys, my camera cut out in the middle of my rant. So yeah, a lot of us are being turned away from the doctor, basically being told it's all in our head, which is interesting because while not very kind and not in the way they meant it, it's actually technically true, in the sense that it starts in our head. The physical symptoms are very real and need to be treated and need to be addressed. The other thing that's come up a lot lately is a huge increase in the incidence of celiac disease and gluten-related intolerances. I believe we're now at a record high of the percentage of people that are affected by this. I believe there's a psychological component to this as well, which I'll talk about in another video, that it's a slightly more specific psychological profile than IBS is. A couple of interesting things about the symptoms of gut-related problems is that the symptoms themselves actually point to an issue in the brain. With celiac disease especially, you'll have things like fatigue, like pretty extreme fatigue, brain fog, memory loss. You can also get things like anxiety, depression, sometimes even ADHD. other behavioral problems, and just generally cognitive decline. If you think about the two populations that are pretty well known for having cognitive problems, issues with the brain, that would be the elderly and also autistic children, or just autistic people in general. They typically have digestive issues, so it goes both ways. A study from the National Review of Gastroenterology and Hepatology concluded, and I quote, "IBS is thought to be the result of disturbed neural function along the gut-brain axis." And this brings us back to the issue of chronic and acute stress. In the example I gave earlier of somebody attempting to take their own life through the use of drugs, that's quite a clear-cut example. But where something like a drug isn't involved, if you don't know to look for it, the connection can be harder to find. But once you start seeing the pattern here, it's quite clear. Celiac disease especially is well known for the onset of the disease coming on after a traumatic event. In my own life, that was actually the birth of my own daughter, which is a story I'll tell another time. Another example I can give you where the person actually made the connection themselves without any prior knowledge to it. They'd had perfect digestion, had got called into the principal's office, and were blamed for something they didn't do, and just generally had this huge emotional tirade unleashed upon them. And ever since then, they've had absolutely terrible digestive problems, and the doctors haven't been able to help. Because of the model that our Western medicine uses, it's these systems are separate. All I can do is give you a pill. And I think people are starting to recognize the futility of that, which I believe is why we're seeing so much increase in people going to see more quote-unquote alternative practitioners, which is interesting because Western medicine has only been around for a few hundred years. But the problem with our society in general is actually the issue of the ongoing chronic stress that just is never addressed. In addition to the suggestions in the book that I mentioned earlier, I believe that everybody should be working with either a coach, a counselor, a therapist, a psychotherapist, depending on what it is that you're really needing support with. Personally, I have a business coach / psychotherapist / coach. Everybody just naturally needs somebody to support them emotionally through their life, even when that life isn't stressful. If you look back to the tribal society, each village had a shaman or some kind of healer that the villagers would go to. Our brains are wired in such a way that we can't really differentiate between a tiger and a projective line. Our brain basically has 3 layers. The first one filters all messages coming in into 4 categories. Some people call this the 4 Fs. Some people call it 4, some people call it 5. Blah. The 5 Fs. Food, fight, flight, freeze, and then sex. So you can imagine what the 5th F is for that. The next part of your brain filters messages into basically a yes or no question. Is this something that I'm going to enjoy doing, or is this something that I'm not going to enjoy doing? And then the final layer of our brain is the logical brain, and that's actually the last part. So it's already gone through these 2 filters. So if you're looking at a project deadline, depending on your personality, your brain's going to filter it as, for example, a flight response in the first layer. Then in the second response, it's going to say, no, I don't want to do this. And then by the time it gets to your logical brain, your brain's already kind of half freaked out over it, and your body's just released a whole cocktail of hormones telling you to freak out and run away. We live in a world that bombards us with things like this every day, hour by hour. And this idea seems to be pretty well known these days, but what's not talked about a lot is what to do about it. Animals actually have this same fight, flight, or freeze response. If you've ever watched deer escape from prey on, say, Discovery Channel or something like that, they'll shake about, they'll stomp around, they'll just generally kind of shake their bodies and get that emotion out of them. Sometimes you'll see them actually go up to other deer and seek comfort from them. But the really significant part of this is that the animal will actually die if it doesn't get to do this. And this is actually how a certain tribe in Africa hunts their prey. They're very skilled marathon runners. This is where some of the best marathon runners in the world come from. They will actually outrun their prey for so long that the animal literally can't get out of this fight, flight, or freeze response. So it it drives itself and overloads its nervous system so much that it just dies. If you look at a very small animal such as a bird or a mouse, we will often say that, say, a small child caught it after a family pet caught it, and we'll say, oh, it died of fright. This is essentially the same thing that's happening. The nervous system gets so overloaded that the animal just dies. When you translate this into the human experience, we are obviously much more complex animals than either a mouse or a deer, but we can start to see some kind of inklings of the significance of it when we don't process these emotions. One of the things that I've been looking into lately is a guy called Peter Levine. He wrote Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma. He actually took this observation of animals and created a process called somatic experiencing, which guides the human animal through these same emotions to help you feel them and process them so that they can finally essentially feel heard and leave the body. So I think that about covers it for this video. In next video we'll cover a few more topics, and then we'll start getting into some suggestions and tips on what you can do, in addition to the ones already mentioned in these videos, to support you in your journey to health. I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments below. Go ahead and like it and subscribe if you'd like to see more. Much health and happiness to you.